The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet little town of Maplewood, casting a golden glow across the streets. It was one of those mornings where everything seemed calm and peaceful, as if nothing could possibly disrupt the rhythm of daily life. The air carried the faint smell of freshly baked bread from the bakery down the street, mingling with the crispness of autumn leaves scattered along the sidewalks. People were slowly waking up, some heading out for their morning jogs, while others prepared for another day at work or school. At the heart of the town stood Maplewood Grocery, a modest store that had been serving the community for decades. Its sign creaked slightly in the breeze, but no one paid much attention. It had always been like that. Inside, Carol Simmons was already at her post behind the cash register, ready to greet customers with her usual warm smile. She had worked at the grocery store for nearly 10 years now, and it felt like a second home to her. The familiar hum of the fluorescent lights above, the soft beeping of the scanner, and the occasional chatter of shoppers made her feel comfortable and secure. Carol wasn't alone that morning. There were a few other employees stocking shelves and organizing displays, but most of the activity came from the steady trickle of early risers stopping by to pick up essentials before heading off to their busy days. Some were regulars who greeted Carol by name, while others simply nodded politely as they passed through the checkout line. It was all part of the routine she had grown accustomed to over the years. Across the store, near the produce section, two men stood chatting casually. One of them was Dwayne Carter, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a commanding presence. Everyone called him The Rock because of his muscular build and unshakable demeanor. He wasn't originally from Maplewood. He had moved there after retiring from the Marines, but he quickly became a respected figure in the community. His deep voice and confident manner often put people at ease, even though his size might initially intimidate some. Standing beside him was John Chin, a complete contrast to Dwayne in both appearance and personality. John was lean and wiry, with glasses perched on his nose and a thoughtful expression that hinted at his sharp mind. Unlike Dwayne, who exuded strength and authority, John's energy was more reserved and analytical. He worked as an IT consultant and had only recently relocated to Maplewood for a quieter lifestyle. Despite their differences, the two men had struck up an unlikely friendship during their frequent visits to the grocery store. As they talked, Dwayne picked up an apple from the display and inspected it carefully. "This one looks good," he said with a grin, tossing it gently into his basket. John chuckled, shaking his head. "You're supposed to check if it's ripe, not just look at it," he teased, reaching for another apple to demonstrate how to press lightly against its skin. Dwayne rolled his eyes playfully but followed John's advice anyway, adding a few more apples to his basket. Neither of them noticed the figure standing hesitantly near the entrance of the store. Frank Miller, a gaunt man in his mid-30s, hovered by the automatic doors, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his dark hoodie. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and beads of sweat dotted his forehead despite the cool morning air. He glanced around nervously, taking in the scene before him, the neatly arranged shelves, the cheerful employees, and the handful of shoppers browsing the aisles. For a moment he considered turning back, walking away from whatever plan he had, concocted in his desperation. But then he remembered why he was here, why he had to go through with it, and steeled himself. Frank took a deep breath and stepped inside, his sneakers squeaking softly against the tiled floor. He lingered near the front of the store for a few moments, pretending to examine a rack of snacks. But his eyes kept darting toward the checkout counters. Finally, he made his way toward Carol's register, choosing her lane because it appeared less crowded than the others. As he approached, Carol looked up and gave him a polite smile, the same one she offered to every customer who came through her line. "Good morning," she said cheerfully, her fingers poised over the keypad of the cash register. "How can I help you today?" Frank didn't respond immediately. Instead, he fidgeted awkwardly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing loudly in his ears. He clenched and unclenched his fists, trying to summon the courage to do what he had come here to do. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Carol tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing in concern. Is everything okay? She asked, her tone gentle and reassuring. For a split second, Frank considered abandoning his plan altogether. But then he reminded himself of the mounting bills, the eviction notice taped to his apartment door, and the hungry faces of his children waiting for him at home. Desperation clawed at his insides, pushing him forward despite the knot of fear in his stomach. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small handgun, holding it tightly in his trembling hand. The transformation in the atmosphere was immediate. Carol's eyes widened in shock as she stared at the weapon, her mouth opening in a silent gasp. Nearby shoppers froze in place, their movements interrupted by the sudden tension that filled the room. Someone dropped a carton of eggs, the sound of shattering shells cutting sharply through the silence. A mother clutched her child closer, whispering urgently for them to stay still. "I need the money," Frank blurted out, his voice shaky but loud enough to carry across the store. "All of it. Now." His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. Carol raised her hands instinctively, her palms facing outward in a gesture of surrender. Her mind raced, searching for something, anything, to say that might diffuse the situation. "Okay," she managed to choke out, her voice trembling. Just don't hurt anyone. I'll give you whatever you want." Frank's grip tightened on the gun as he glanced around the store, his gaze darting between the frightened faces of the customers and the employees behind the counters. He could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. Doubt crept into his mind, whispering that this was a mistake, that he should leave before things spiraled further out of control. But the image of his family's empty refrigerator flashed before his eyes, silencing the doubts and driving him onward. Unbeknownst to Frank, Dwayne and John had stopped their conversation when they heard the commotion. They turned their heads, simultaneously, their eyes locking onto the scene unfolding at the front of the store. Dwayne's jaw tightened as he assessed the situation, his military training kicking in automatically. John, though visibly startled, quickly composed himself, his analytical mind already working through potential solutions. "What do we do?" John whispered, keeping his voice low so as not to draw attention. Dwayne didn't respond right away. Instead, he watched Frank closely, noting the way the man's hand shook as he held the gun. Despite the weapon, there was something about Frank's demeanor that suggested he wasn't fully committed to violence. Maybe it was the hesitation in his movements, or the way his eyes darted nervously around the room. Whatever it was, Dwayne saw an opportunity, a chance to intervene without escalating the danger. "We stop him," Dwayne replied finally, his voice firm and resolute. "But we have to be smart about it." John nodded, swallowing hard as he processed the gravity of the situation. He trusted Dwayne implicitly, but that didn't make the prospect of confronting an armed robber any less daunting. Still, he knew they couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Not when Carol's life, and potentially the lives of others, was at stake. As Frank continued barking orders at Carol, demanding that she empty the cash register, Dwayne and John exchanged a final glance. Without saying another word, they began moving cautiously toward the front of the store, their steps deliberate and measured. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Every second felt like an eternity, stretching endlessly as the drama unfolded. And yet amidst the chaos there was a glimmer of hope. Two ordinary men, united by circumstance, were preparing to step into the fray, not because they sought heroism, but because they believed in doing what was right. Their actions would soon ripple through the lives of everyone present, leaving an indelible mark on the fabric of their small town. But for now, the focus remained squarely on the unfolding confrontation, with Carol caught in the middle and Frank teetering on the edge of panic. The stage was set. The players were in position, and the next few moments would determine whether the day ended in tragedy or triumph. The tension in the grocery store was thick, pressing down on everyone like a heavy blanket. Carol stood frozen behind the register, her hands still raised in surrender. Her mind raced, trying to process what was happening. She had always thought of herself as someone who handled stress well. After all, she dealt with difficult customers and long hours every day. But this was something entirely different. This wasn't just an angry shopper or a misplaced item. This was real fear, gripping her heart and refusing to let go. Frank's voice cut through the silence again, louder this time. "Hurry up!" he shouted, his words sharp and jagged. The gun in his hand wavered slightly, pointing at Carol one moment and then sweeping across the room the next. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of resistance. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He really didn't. But desperation had driven him to this point, and now he felt trapped. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, each tick of the clock pushing him closer to a decision he wasn't sure he could make. Nearby, Dwayne and John continued their careful approach, moving slowly along the edge of the aisle. They stayed low, using the shelves as cover while keeping a close eye on Frank. Dwayne's movements were deliberate, calculated, his years of military training guiding him. John followed closely behind, his heart pounding in his chest, but his mind focused. He trusted Dwayne completely, even if the situation seemed overwhelming. "Do you have a plan?" John whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the store's fluorescent lights. Dwayne nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving Frank. "We distract him," he murmured. "Get him to focus on us instead of her. Then we take him down." John swallowed hard, nodding in agreement. It sounded simple enough in theory, but putting it into practice was another matter entirely. Still, he knew they didn't have a choice. Carol was in danger, and every second they waited made things worse. Taking a deep breath, he prepared himself for what was about to happen. Meanwhile, the other shoppers in the store reacted in different ways. Some crouched behind shelves, their faces pale with fear. Others crept quietly toward the exits, hoping to slip away unnoticed. A young mother clutched her child tightly, whispering soothing words to keep the little girl calm. One man, older and wearing a baseball cap, pulled out his phone and began recording the scene, his hands shaking as he held it steady. No one spoke loudly, afraid that even the smallest sound might set Frank off. Carol, meanwhile, fumbled with the cash drawer, her fingers trembling as she tried to open it. The metal edges felt cold against her skin, and she struggled to focus on the task at hand. Her thoughts were a jumble of panic and confusion. What did Frank want? How much money was in the drawer? Would giving it to him be enough to end this nightmare? "I'm doing it," she said aloud, her voice shaky but clear. "Just, please don't hurt anyone." Frank didn't respond. Instead, he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his breathing growing heavier. Sweat dripped down his face, stinging his eyes. He hated this, hated everything about it. But he couldn't see another way out. His mind flashed back to the eviction notice taped to his apartment door, the empty cupboards at home, and the hungry stares of his children. Those images fueled his resolve even as doubt gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. Everyone turned their heads toward the source of the noise, including Frank. It came from the produce section, where a display of canned goods had toppled over, sending cans rolling across the floor. For a split second, the distraction worked perfectly. Frank's attention snapped away from Carol, his gun swinging toward the commotion. "What the hell?" he yelled, his voice cracking under the strain. "Who's there?" It was John who had caused the crash, deliberately knocking over the display to draw Frank's focus. Now, standing near the scattered cans, he raised his hands slowly, showing that he wasn't armed. "Hey man, calm down," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Nobody needs to get hurt here." Frank's grip tightened on the gun as he stared at John, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Stay back," he shouted, taking a step forward. "I mean it." Behind him, Dwayne seized the opportunity. Moving quickly but quietly, he closed the distance between himself and Frank. Years of training kicked in, allowing him to move with precision and purpose. He positioned himself just out of Frank's direct line of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to act. Carol, still behind the register, noticed Dwayne's movement out of the corner of her eye. Her heart leapt with a mixture of hope and fear. She wanted to shout a warning, to tell him to be careful, but she forced herself to stay silent. Instead, she subtly slid her phone toward herself, ready to call 911 if things went wrong. John kept talking, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Look, I get it, he said, taking another cautious step forward. You're in a tough spot, but this isn't the answer. Let's figure something else out, okay? Frank hesitated, his gun wavering slightly. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. Maybe John was right. Maybe there was another way. But then the image of his family's empty refrigerator flashed in his mind again, and his resolve hardened. Shut up, he snapped, his voice rising. You don't know anything about me. As Frank's attention remained fixed on John, Dwayne made his move. With surprising speed for someone his size, he lunged forward, closing the final few feet between them in an instant. His massive hand shot out, grabbing Frank's wrist with unyielding strength. Frank cried out in pain, the gun slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. No, Frank shouted, struggling to break free, but Dwayne's grip was like iron. He twisted Frank's arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees. The robber's cries echoed through the store, mingling with the gasps and murmurs of the shocked onlookers. John rushed forward, scooping up the gun before anyone else could reach it. He tucked it safely into his pocket, ensuring it was out of harm's way. It's over, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. It's done. For a moment, the entire store seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, people began to emerge from their hiding spots, their faces filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. The young mother hugged her child tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. The man with the baseball cap stopped recording, lowering his phone as the reality of the situation sank in. Even Carol, still standing behind the register, allowed herself to lower her hands, her body sagging with exhaustion. Dwayne kept a firm hold on Frank, his expression unreadable. Frank, for his part, slumped in defeat, his earlier bravado completely gone. Tears streamed down his face as he muttered, I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't know what else to do. Carol finally found her voice, her words trembling but heartfelt. Thank you, she said, looking first at Dwayne and then at John. You saved me. Dwayne nodded slightly, his gaze softening, for a moment. You're welcome, he replied simply. John stepped closer, glancing around the store to ensure everyone was safe. Someone should call the police, he said, though he suspected someone already had. Sure enough, within moments, the distant wail of sirens could be heard approaching. Help was on the way. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere in the store began to shift. The initial shock gave way to a sense of gratitude and relief. People started talking among themselves, sharing their experiences and marveling at how quickly the situation had unfolded and how narrowly disaster had been avoided. Outside, the flashing lights of police cars illuminated the parking lot, casting blue and red streaks across the windows. When the officers arrived, they quickly took control of the scene. Frank was handcuffed and led away, his head bowed in shame. The police questioned witnesses, jotting down notes as they pieced together what had happened. Carol recounted the events in a shaky voice, her gratitude evident as she described Dwayne and John's bravery. Other shoppers chimed in, praising the two men for their quick thinking and selflessness. By the time the authorities finished their initial investigation, word of the incident had already begun spreading through Maplewood. Neighbors called each other, sharing details and speculating about what might have happened if Dwayne and John hadn't intervened. Social media buzzed with posts about the attempted robbery and the heroes who had stopped it. By evening, the story had become the talk of the town, with many expressing admiration for the courage displayed by two ordinary men in an extraordinary situation. Back inside the store, Dwayne and John stood side by side, watching as the last of the police officers packed up their equipment and prepared to leave. Neither of them said much. There wasn't much to say. They had acted because it was the right thing to do, not because they sought recognition or praise. Still, they couldn't deny the weight of what had transpired, or the impact it would have on their lives moving forward. You okay? Dwayne asked finally, breaking the silence. John nodded, exhaling slowly. Yeah, he replied. Just processing everything, I guess. Dwayne clapped him lightly on the shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie and respect. We did good, he said simply, And with that, the two men walked out of the store together, stepping into the crisp autumn air. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, bathing the town in warm light. Life in Maplewood would return to normal, soon enough, but for now the memory of what had happened lingered, a reminder of the strength and compassion that could arise. The sun was still shining brightly outside, but inside the grocery store the mood remained heavy. The police officers had finished their initial investigation, and Frank had been taken away in the back of a squad car. His face was hidden behind the window, but his slumped posture told its own story. Defeat, shame, and regret. As the sirens faded into the distance, the shoppers who had witnessed the robbery began to disperse, some heading home while others lingered to talk about what had just happened. Dwayne and John stood near the entrance of the store, watching as the last of the police vehicles pulled away. They hadn't moved much since the chaos had ended, both of them feeling drained from the adrenaline rush that had coursed through their bodies during the confrontation. Their clothes were slightly disheveled, and there was a faint sheen of sweat on their foreheads, but neither of them seemed to notice. Instead, they focused on the aftermath, observing the reactions of those around them. Carol was still at her register, though she wasn't ringing up any purchases now. She sat on a stool someone had brought for her, her hands clasped tightly, together in her lap. Her face was pale and her eyes looked distant, as if she were replaying the events over and over in her mind. A few coworkers hovered nearby, offering words of comfort and support, but Carol barely responded. She nodded occasionally, murmuring thanks, but it was clear her thoughts were elsewhere. One of the customers approached her cautiously, a middle-aged woman named Lisa who often shopped at the store. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, placing a reassuring hand on Carol's shoulder. Carol blinked as if coming out of a trance and managed a weak smile. "I think so," she replied softly. "It's just a lot to take in." Lisa squeezed her shoulder lightly. "You're safe now, that's what matters." She glanced toward Dwayne and John, who were still standing by the door. "And we owe those two men a big thank you. If they hadn't stepped in—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The implication hung in the air, unspoken yet understood. Carol followed Lisa's gaze, her expression softening with gratitude. "They saved me," she said simply, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay them." Nearby, other shoppers echoed similar sentiments. A young man wearing a hoodie leaned against a shelf, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've lived here my whole life, and nothing like this has ever happened before," he muttered to no one in particular. "Those guys are heroes." A teenage girl standing beside him nodded vigorously. "Totally. I mean, who does something like that? They could have gotten hurt or worse." Her friend chimed in, her tone filled with admiration. "That's why it's so amazing they didn't even hesitate. They just acted." As these conversations unfolded, Dwayne and John tried to stay out of the spotlight. They weren't comfortable being called heroes or receiving praise. To them, what they had done wasn't extraordinary. It was simply the right thing to do. Still, they couldn't ignore the attention entirely. People kept glancing their way, whispering among themselves, and occasionally approaching to offer heartfelt thanks. One such person was an older gentleman named Bill, who walked up to them with a warm smile. He extended his hand to Dwayne first, then to John. "You two are something else," he said earnestly. "What you did today, well, it takes guts. Real guts." Dwayne shook the man's hand firmly, his expression calm but unreadable. "Just doing what needed to be done," he replied modestly. John nodded in agreement, adding, "Anyone would have done the same." Bill chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Don't be so sure about that. Most people freeze in situations like this, but you two, you stepped up. That says a lot about your character." Neither Dwayne nor John knew how to respond to that, so they simply thanked Bill for his kind words and let him go on his way. After he left, John turned to Dwayne with a wry smile. "Well, that was awkward," he joked, trying to lighten the mood. Dwayne smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Tell me about it. Feels weird, doesn't it?" "Yeah," John admitted. "Like we're not supposed to be the center of attention." Dwayne shrugged, glancing around the store. "People are grateful," That's all it is. Once things settle down, they'll forget about us. John raised an eyebrow skeptically. You really think so? I hope so, Dwayne replied, his tone quieter now. We didn't do this for recognition. We did it because it was the right thing to do. John nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. He knew Dwayne was right. They hadn't acted out of a desire for fame or glory. Still, it was hard not to feel a sense of pride in what they had accomplished. Together, they had prevented a tragedy, and that was something worth holding on to. As the crowd thinned out, Carol finally found the strength to approach them. She walked slowly, her steps hesitant but determined. When she reached them, she stopped, looking up at Dwayne and then at John. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. I don't even know where to start, she began, her words heartfelt. Thank you doesn't seem like enough. Dwayne shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. You don't have to thank us, he said gruffly. We're just glad you're okay. John nodded, offering her a small, reassuring smile. Seriously, Carol, don't worry about it. You'd do the same for us. Carol smiled weakly, wiping at her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. Maybe, she said, softly, but I doubt I'd be as brave as you two were. You never know until you're put in that situation, John replied kindly. Sometimes bravery isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared. Carol considered his words for a moment, then nodded slowly. Still, she said, her voice firmer now, what you did today, it means everything to me. And not just to me, but to everyone here. You made a difference. Before either of them could respond, Lisa appeared beside Carol, placing a supportive arm around her shoulders. Come on, Carol, she said gently. Let's get you home. You've had a long morning. Carol hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Okay, she agreed, turning back to Dwayne and John one last time. Thank you again for everything. They watched as Lisa guided Carol toward the exit, the two women exchanging quiet words as they went. Once they were gone, the store felt eerily quiet, almost empty despite the presence of a few remaining employees cleaning up the mess left behind by the chaos. Broken eggs and spilled cereal littered parts of the floor, and toppled displays awaited restocking. It was a reminder that life had been disrupted, but also that it could be put back together. Dwayne sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. This place is going to need some work, he remarked, gesturing to the scattered debris. John chuckled dryly. Yeah, but at least it's still standing. Could have been a lot worse. That's true, Dwayne agreed, his tone thoughtful. Still, can't help wondering what happens next, for him, I mean. John frowned, understanding immediately who Dwayne was referring to. Frank? Yeah, Dwayne said, nodding. Guy looked desperate. Not evil, you know, just cornered. John thought about that for a moment, remembering the tears streaming down Frank's face as he begged for understanding. Desperation makes people do crazy things, he said finally. Doesn't excuse it, but maybe there's more to his story than we know. Dwayne nodded slowly, his expression grim. Let's hope the cops figure it out. Maybe they can get him some help instead of throwing him in jail and forgetting about him. They should, John agreed. He might have been wrong, but he didn't deserve to end up like that. Their conversation drifted off after that, replaced by a shared silence as they reflected on the day's events. Both men knew they had played a role in preventing something terrible, but they also recognized that their actions were only part of a larger picture. There were questions left unanswered, lives affected beyond their control, and consequences yet to unfold. Eventually, they decided it was time to leave. The store manager had thanked them profusely, insisting they take the rest of the day off, even though neither of them technically worked there, and promising to cover any costs related to the incident. It was a gesture of gratitude that neither Dwayne nor John had expected, but they accepted it graciously nonetheless. Outside, the air felt cooler now, carrying the crisp scent of autumn leaves. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few cars belonging to employees and stragglers. Dwayne and John walked side by side, their footsteps crunching softly against the pavement. Neither of them spoke for a while, content to let the peacefulness of the moment wash over them. Finally, John broke the silence. "So, what now?" Dwayne shrugged, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Now? We move on. Life goes on, right?" "Right," John echoed, though his tone carried a hint of uncertainty. "Just feels strange, you know? Like everything's changed, but at the same time nothing has." "That's how it usually is," Dwayne replied knowingly. "Big moments happen, but the world keeps spinning. Doesn't mean they aren't important, though." John nodded, considering his friend's words. "Guess you're right. Still, I don't think I'll forget this anytime soon." "Me neither," Dwayne admitted. "But that's okay. Sometimes remembering helps us become better." They reached Dwayne's truck, parked near the edge of the lot. He unlocked the door and climbed inside, motioning for John to join him. "Come on," he said. "Let's grab some coffee, my treat." John grinned, climbing into the passenger seat. "Now that's an offer I can't refuse." The diner on the corner of Main Street was a cozy little place, the kind where everyone seemed to know each other. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the aroma of pancakes and bacon. It was a favorite spot for locals, especially during breakfast hours when the morning rush brought in workers, students, and retirees alike. On this particular day, however, it wasn't busy at all. Most people were still recovering from the shock of the robbery, or perhaps they were simply too distracted by the news spreading through town. Dwayne and John sat in a booth near the window, their cups of coffee steaming gently in front of them. Neither had touched their drinks yet. Both were lost in thought, replaying the events of the morning over and over in their minds. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The golden light filtered through the glass, painting patterns on the table between them. "So," John said finally, breaking the silence, "what do you think will happen to Frank?" Dwayne leaned back against the booth, his broad shoulders relaxed but his expression serious. He stared out the window for a moment before answering. "Depends on what the cops find out about him," he replied slowly. "If he's just some guy who made a bad decision because he was desperate, maybe they'll cut him some slack." John nodded, twirling a spoon absent-mindedly in his hand. "Yeah, I mean, he didn't seem like a hardened criminal, more like someone backed into a corner." "Exactly," Dwayne agreed. "People don't usually pull stunts like that unless they're out of options. Doesn't make it right, but it does explain it." John sighed, resting his elbows on the table. "Still, it's hard not to feel sorry for him. Whatever he did, no one deserves to end up like that." Dwayne glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "You sound like you're defending him." "I'm not," John clarified quickly. "I'm just saying, we stopped him today, but what happens tomorrow? If nothing changes, he might try again, or worse, someone else might step in and get hurt." Dwayne frowned, considering the point. "That's true, but fixing that kind of problem isn't our job. All we could do was stop him from hurting anyone today. What comes next is up to the system." "The system," John repeated, his tone skeptical. "You really think the system works for guys like Frank?" Dwayne shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. "Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Either way, it's not something we can control." John didn't respond right away. He stared down at his untouched cup, watching the ripples form as he nudged it slightly with his fingers. The truth was, he couldn't shake the image of Frank's tear-streaked face, the raw desperation in his voice as he muttered, "I didn't want to hurt anyone." It reminded him of stories he'd read or heard. People pushed to the brink by circumstances beyond their control, forced to make impossible choices. "Do you think he has kids?" John asked suddenly, looking up at Dwayne. Dwayne blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Why would you ask that?" "I don't know," John admitted. "It's just, when he was talking earlier, he mentioned needing money for his family. And later, when we had him on the ground, he kept saying stuff like, 'I didn't have a choice.' It sounded personal, you know? Like there was more to the story than just greed." Dwayne nodded slowly, his brow furrowing as he thought about it. Could be. A lot of people turn to crime because they're trying to feed their families. Doesn't excuse it, but it makes sense. Right, John said quietly. And if he does have kids, what happens to them now? Do they lose their dad to jail? Or worse, do they grow up thinking that's the only way to survive? Dwayne didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out the window again, his gaze distant. He knew John had a point. Growing up in a small town like Maplewood, he'd seen plenty of families struggle, caught in cycles of poverty and bad decisions. Some managed to break free, but others weren't so lucky. Dwayne had always believed in second chances, but he also understood that sometimes the odds were stacked too high against people. They'll figure it out, Dwayne said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Social services, family members, someone will step in to help if they need it. Maybe, John replied, though he sounded unconvinced. But even if they do, it's not going to fix everything. Losing a parent, that leaves scars. Scars, that last a lifetime. The conversation trailed off after that, leaving an uneasy silence between them. Both men sipped their coffee, their thoughts heavy with unspoken concerns. They had done their part to prevent a tragedy, but the bigger picture loomed large in their minds. What happened next wasn't entirely up to them, but it weighed on their consciences nonetheless. After a while, the waitress came by to check on them, refilling their cups and offering a warm smile. "Everything okay, boys?" she asked, her tone friendly and familiar. Dwayne nodded politely. "Yeah, thanks. Just tired, I guess." She chuckled sympathetically. "Well, after what you two went through today, I'd say you've earned a little rest. Whole town's talking about you, you know." John groaned softly, sinking lower in his seat. "Don't remind me." The waitress laughed, patting his shoulder lightly. "Oh, come on. You should be proud. Not every day you meet real-life heroes." "We're not heroes," Dwayne interjected firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We just did what anyone else would have done." She raised an eyebrow skeptically, but didn't press the issue. "All right then. Suit yourselves. But trust me, people are grateful. Even if you don't want the attention, it's nice to know good folks are still around." With that, she walked away, leaving Dwayne and John alone once again. John sighed, shaking his head. "She's right, you know. People are grateful, whether we like it or not." "Doesn't change anything," Dwayne replied gruffly. "Being called a hero doesn't make us special. We just reacted. That's all." John smirked, leaning back against the booth. "Yeah, well, most people wouldn't have reacted like that. Let's face it, you're stronger than average and I'm smarter than average. Put us together and we make a pretty decent team." Dwayne chuckled despite himself, rolling his eyes. "Don't let it go to your head." They shared a laugh, the tension easing slightly as the conversation shifted to lighter topics. For a while, they talked about random things, the weather, upcoming football games, and whether the diner's apple pie was worth ordering. It was a welcome distraction, allowing them to momentarily forget about the weightier issues lingering in the background. Eventually, though, reality crept back in. As they paid their bill and stepped outside, the cool evening air hit them like a reminder of everything they'd been through that day. The streets were quieter now, with only a few cars passing by. Storefronts glowed softly under dim streetlights, and the hum of crickets filled the air. "You heading home?" Dwayne asked as they reached his truck. John hesitated, glancing at his watch. "Not yet. Think I'll take a walk first, clear my head a bit." Dwayne nodded understandingly. "All right. Don't stay out too late. Tomorrow's another day." "Thanks, Dad," John joked, earning a playful glare from Dwayne. As Dwayne drove off, John began walking down the sidewalk, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The night was peaceful, almost serene, but his mind remained restless. He couldn't stop thinking about Frank and Carol and the customers at the store and the ripple effect of what had happened. Every action carried consequences, big or small, and today's events were no exception. By the time he reached the park at the edge of town, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. John found a bench overlooking the lake and sat down, letting the quiet soothe him. Across the water, lights twinkled from houses dotting the shoreline, their reflections shimmering like fireflies. It was beautiful, a stark contrast to the chaos of the morning. Sitting there, John realized something important. Life was unpredictable, messy, and often unfair. But within that unpredictability lay moments of clarity, opportunities to act with courage and compassion. Today had been one of those moments for him and Dwayne, and while they couldn't solve every problem or save everyone, they had made a difference. For Carol, for the customers, and maybe even for Frank. He smiled faintly, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. Whatever happened next, he knew they had done the right thing, and sometimes that was enough. The days that followed the attempted robbery in Maplewood passed quickly, but the memory of it lingered like a shadow over the town. People went about their routines, working, shopping, and chatting with neighbors, but conversations often circled back to what had happened at the grocery store. It was as if the event had become a shared experience, a moment that bonded the community together in ways no one could have anticipated. For Carol Simmons, life slowly began to return to normal. She resumed her shifts at the grocery store, greeting customers with the same warm smile she always had. But there were subtle changes, too. Her hands sometimes trembled when handling cash, and she found herself glancing nervously whenever someone new approached her register. The image of Frank's gun pointing at her replayed in her mind during quiet moments, though she tried hard not to dwell on it. Her co-workers noticed her unease but didn't push her to talk about it. Instead, they offered small gestures of support. "Oh, my babe," kind word here, a helping hand there. One afternoon, Lisa stopped by with a homemade casserole, insisting Carol take the evening off to relax. "You've been through a lot," Lisa said gently. "Don't feel like you have to rush back to normal." Carol appreciated the kindness, even if she wasn't sure how to respond. "Thanks," she said softly. "I'm trying. It's just hard to forget." Lisa nodded sympathetically. "Of course it is. But you're stronger than you think. And remember, you're not alone. Everyone here cares about you." Those words stayed with Carol long after Lisa left. They reminded her that she wasn't isolated in her fear, that the people around her understood and wanted to help. Over time, she started to feel a little more like herself again, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of daily life. Meanwhile, Dwayne Carter and John Chin became local celebrities, whether they liked it or not. Their names popped up in conversations throughout Maplewood, accompanied by stories of bravery and quick thinking. Some called them heroes. Others simply referred to them as the guys who stopped the robber. Regardless of the title, their actions had left an indelible mark on the town. At first, both men tried to brush off the attention. Dwayne kept to himself, spending his free time working on projects around his house or taking long walks along the lake. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight and found it uncomfortable, especially when strangers stopped him to thank him. "It's nothing," he'd say gruffly, shrugging off their praise. Anyone would have done the same. John handled the attention differently. While he also felt awkward accepting compliments, he couldn't deny the positive impact their actions had made. At work, colleagues patted him on the back and joked about making him Employee of the Month. Neighbors waved enthusiastically when they saw him walking his dog, and kids in the park asked for high fives. Though it made him chuckle, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not in himself, but in the fact that he and Dwayne had inspired others to believe in the power of courage and compassion. Despite their differences in personality, both men agreed on one thing. They weren't heroes because of what they'd done. To them, heroism wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic rescues. It was about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. And while they appreciated the gratitude of the townspeople, they hoped the focus would eventually shift away from them and toward the broader lessons of the day. As the week went on, details about Frank Miller began to emerge. Local news outlets reported that he had lost his job months earlier and was struggling to provide for his family. His wife had left him shortly afterward, taking their 2 young children with her. Facing mounting bills and eviction notices, Frank, had grown desperate, convinced that robbing the grocery store was his only option. When the police searched his apartment, they found little more than empty cupboards and unpaid utility notices. There was no evidence of prior criminal activity, leading investigators to conclude that the robbery attempt had been a last resort born out of desperation. This revelation sparked mixed reactions among the residents of Maplewood. Some viewed Frank as a victim of circumstance, deserving of sympathy and second chances. Others saw him as a dangerous individual who had put innocent lives at risk, regardless of his motivations. During a court hearing held several days later, Frank appeared visibly shaken. His lawyer argued for leniency, citing his client's lack of criminal history and the extreme financial hardships he had faced. Prosecutors countered that holding a gun to someone's head was a serious offense, regardless of intent. In the end, the judge decided to delay sentencing until a full evaluation of Frank's mental state and background could be completed. News of the hearing spread quickly through Maplewood, reigniting debates about justice, accountability, and compassion. At the diner where Dwayne and John had gone for coffee after the robbery, patrons discussed the case passionately over meals. Some believed Frank should receive counseling and job training instead of prison time, while others felt punishment was necessary to deter similar crimes in the future. One evening, as Dwayne and John sat in their usual booth, they listened quietly to the chatter around them. A group of older men at the counter debated loudly, their voices rising above the clatter of dishes and silverware. "He shouldn't get off easy," one of them declared, slamming his fist on the table. "What if someone had gotten hurt?" Another man shook his head, leaning forward earnestly. "But what choice did he have? You ever been that broke? That desperate?" The argument continued, growing heated as each side defended its position. Dwayne and John exchanged a glance, neither of them saying a word. They knew better than anyone how complex the situation was, and how impossible it was to find a perfect solution. Finally, John leaned closer to Dwayne, keeping his voice low, so only they could hear. "What do you think?" he asked. "About Frank, I mean." Dwayne sighed, swirling the dregs of his coffee absently. "I think it's complicated. Guy made a bad decision, sure, but locking him up isn't going to solve anything. Not unless we figure out why he ended up there in the first place." John nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, and let's face it, the system's not great at helping people like him. Even if he gets probation or rehab, it won't fix the bigger issues." "Exactly," Dwayne agreed. "But fixing those issues? That's way above our pay grade." John chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Tell me about it. Still, it feels wrong to just walk away and pretend it's not our problem." "You're not pretending," Dwayne said firmly. "You're acknowledging your limits. We did what we could. Now it's up to the rest of the world to step up." John considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Guess you're right. Doesn't mean I have to like it, though." They finished their meal in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the sun had set completely, leaving the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. As they stepped out of the diner, Dwayne turned to John with a wry grin. "Want to grab some air, maybe clear our heads?" "Sure," John replied, falling into step beside him. "Fresh air sounds good." They walked together down Main Street, their footsteps echoing faintly against the pavement. The town felt peaceful now, almost serene, as if the chaos of the robbery had never occurred. Yet beneath the surface, questions remained unanswered, wounds unhealed. For Dwayne and John, the challenge lay not in forgetting what had happened, but in finding meaning in it. In using the experience to grow, to connect, and to remind themselves of the importance of standing up for what was right. As they reached the edge of town, John paused, looking out at the horizon. "You know," he said quietly, "this whole thing has made me think a lot about responsibility, about how much we owe each other, even when we don't realize it." Dwayne nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, life's messy, and sometimes it feels like we're all just winging it, but every once in a while we get a chance to make a difference, big or small. And today," John added, smiling faintly, "we got lucky enough to take that chance." Dwayne chuckled, clapping John lightly on the shoulder. Luck had nothing to do with it. We just did what needed to be done. With that, they turned and headed back toward the center of town, the weight of the past week still heavy on their shoulders, but lighter now, carried by the knowledge that they had acted with integrity and heart. Whatever came next, they were ready to face it together. Weeks passed, and the town of Maplewood settled into a rhythm once again. The grocery store reopened fully, its shelves restocked, and its employees back to their usual routines. Carol continued working her shifts, though she still felt a pang of unease whenever the automatic doors opened and someone new walked in. But over time that feeling lessened. She reminded herself daily that she was safe now, and that the kindness of others had helped her through the hardest moments. Dwayne Carter and John Chin tried to blend back into their ordinary lives as well. For Dwayne, this meant returning to his quiet hobbies, fixing up old furniture, tending to his garden, and taking long walks by the lake. He wasn't one for seeking attention, and he preferred to let the commotion die down on its own. Still, every so often, someone would stop him at the hardware store or the gas station to thank him for what he'd done. Each time, Dwayne gave the same response. I just did what anyone else would have done. John handled things differently. His analytical mind couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened: the robbery, Frank's desperation, the reactions of the townspeople. He found himself thinking about these topics during work meetings and late-night conversations with friends. It wasn't that he was obsessed, rather, he saw the incident as a turning point, not just for himself, but for the entire community. 1 evening, as autumn leaves swirled in the wind outside his apartment window, John sat at his desk typing away on his laptop. He had decided to write an article for the local newspaper, sharing his perspective on the events at the grocery store. The piece wasn't about glorifying himself or Dwayne. It was about highlighting the importance of stepping up when it mattered most. In the article, John wrote about how fear can paralyze people, but courage can inspire action. He talked about Frank's story, emphasizing that while his actions were wrong, they stemmed from a place of desperation. And he ended with a call to action, urging readers to look out for one another, to offer support before situations escalated to such extremes. When the article was published, it sparked a wave of discussion throughout Maplewood. Some praised John for his thoughtful words, while others debated whether compassion could truly solve problems like poverty and crime. Regardless, the article brought attention to issues many had overlooked, issues that affected not only Frank, but countless others struggling silently in the shadows. Meanwhile, updates on Frank's case trickled in. After weeks of evaluations and hearings, the court decided on a sentence that balanced accountability with rehabilitation. Instead of prison, Frank was placed under strict supervision, required to attend counseling sessions and complete job training programs. Additionally, social services stepped in to assist his family, ensuring his children received proper care and education. While some residents felt the punishment was too lenient, others believed it was a step in the right direction. Lisa, Carol's friend, summed it up best during a conversation at the coffee shop. "It's not perfect," she said, stirring her latte thoughtfully. "But maybe this way we're helping instead of punishing. Maybe we're giving him a chance to turn things around." Carol nodded in agreement. "I hope so," she said softly. "No one deserves to feel that hopeless." The ripple effect of the robbery extended beyond individual lives. It touched the heart of the community itself. Inspired by the bravery of Dwayne and John, several townspeople began organizing initiatives aimed at supporting those in need. A food bank expanded its hours, volunteers started tutoring programs for struggling families, and a fundraiser was launched to create affordable housing options in the area. Slowly but surely, Maplewood came together, united by a shared desire to prevent similar tragedies in the future. For Dwayne and John, life moved forward in quieter ways. Though they remained close friends, their interactions became less frequent as they returned to their respective routines. Still, there was an unspoken bond between them, a mutual understanding forged in the heat of crisis. Whenever they crossed paths, whether at the grocery store or the diner, they exchanged knowing smiles, reminders of the day they had changed, the course of someone's life. One crisp November morning, Dwayne and John met by chance at the park near the lake. They hadn't planned it. They simply arrived at the same time, drawn by the beauty of the changing season. The trees were ablaze, with fiery reds and golds, their leaves carpeting the ground in vibrant hues. Ducks paddled lazily across the water, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke. "Fancy meeting you here?" John said with a grin, sitting down on a bench beside Dwayne. Dwayne chuckled, resting his elbows on his knees. "Guess great. Minds think alike." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the ducks and listening to the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Eventually, John broke the quiet. "You ever wonder if we'll remember this moment years from now, like, will it still matter?" Dwayne tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "Probably not in the way you're thinking," he replied slowly. "Life moves on, you know. People forget details, but I think the bigger picture stays with us. The lesson, the feeling of doing something meaningful." John nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, that makes sense. It's not about remembering every little thing, it's about carrying it forward somehow." "Exactly," Dwayne agreed. "And who knows? Maybe someday someone else will step up when it counts because of what we did today." The idea lingered between them, comforting in its simplicity. Neither man needed recognition or praise. They knew the true value of their actions lay in the impact they'd made, however small it might seem in the grand scheme of things. They had stood up for what was right, even when it was hard, and that was enough. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting warm light across the park, Dwayne stood up and stretched. "Well, I should get going," he said, brushing leaves off his jacket. "Got a few errands to run." John rose as well, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Same here, thanks for the chat." "No problem," Dwayne replied with a smile. "Catch you later." With that, they parted ways, each heading in opposite directions. But as they walked, they carried with them the knowledge that their lives, and the lives of others, had been forever changed by a single act of courage. It wasn't about being heroes or making headlines. It was about showing up, standing firm, and reminding themselves and their community that even in the darkest moments, hope could shine through. Back in Maplewood, the townspeople continued to rebuild not just their grocery store but their sense of connection and purpose. Conversations shifted from fear and uncertainty to resilience and possibility. Children played in the park without worry, families gathered for holiday meals, and strangers greeted each other warmly on the street. Life went on, as it always did, but with a renewed sense of gratitude and responsibility. And somewhere in the distance, Frank Miller began the long journey toward rebuilding his life. It wouldn't be easy, he knew that. But for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to start over. In the end, the story of the attempted robbery wasn't just about danger or heroism. It was about humanity, the messy, complicated, beautiful web of relationships that bound people together. It was about choices, both good and bad, and the power of ordinary individuals to make extraordinary differences. And it was about a small town called Maplewood, where two men named Dwayne and John showed everyone that even in the face of fear, courage could prevail.